Hi everyone, welcome to our fourth and final video, I promise. And we're going to pick up in class on Tuesday discussing mandatory and persuasive precedent together. So remember how I told you in video number 2 that the first thing, one of the first things we need to learn from our client or figure out for our client is what jurisdiction we're in. So we need to know where our client's case is pending, where our client's matter is, in what court, state, and federal, and also what level. For example, we could be working with a client when they file their case in, Massachusetts Superior Court, Middlesex County Superior Court. Or maybe we're first getting involved with the client when their case is already up on appeal to the Supreme Judicial Court. We don't really know until we speak with that particular client. So we first need to know where our client's matter is in these charts. What particular court, what particular state, and by that we mean what jurisdiction is our client in. Then we move into our research question. And again, we can pick any hypothetical. Let's this time choose employment discrimination. I was fired from my job, and I think it's because I was discriminated against because of my gender. And I want to bring a lawsuit against my hypothetical employer, Middlesex Company. And so it's Sugarman versus Middlesex Company. Let's assume that I'm a Massachusetts resident, my company's in Massachusetts, and my lawyers determined that the place to file the lawsuit for jurisdictional purposes is here in Middlesex County Superior Court. And you are a paralegal on the team of researchers helping me to build my employment discrimination case against Middlesex Company. Now, you go off, and we'll talk about doing keyword searches, and we'll talk about how to find the cases themselves. That's coming in just about a week and a half. But let's assume that you already know that step. And in your research, you find a case from the Massachusetts Appeals Court. And that has to do with employment discrimination based on gender. Let's assume you also find cases from the First Circuit Court of Appeals that address gender discrimination in the workplace. Let's assume you've expanded your search and you also find cases from the Supreme Court of California and the Supreme Court of Florida, and you find a dozen cases from different jurisdictions all over the country that all appear to be pretty similar to my employment discrimination case. And so you say, look at all this precedent I just found. Now, you might be thinking, why would I look at California cases if your matter is here in Massachusetts? And if you're already thinking that, you're already thinking about mandatory and persuasive precedent, or mandatory and persuasive authorities. In this context, the word mandatory is sometimes called binding authority, so it's mandatory authority or binding authority. If my client is here, right here in Massachusetts Superior Court, when I conduct research, any case that I find in my research that is in my jurisdictional line and is a higher court than what my client is in is called mandatory binding precedent. And you can tell by its name that it's called that because the judge down here in Superior Court and the lawyers down here are bound by that precedent. They can't just go changing the law all on their own because there's precedent from a higher court in my same jurisdictional line. That's why I really like these triangles, because it helps us visualize where, find where your client is in this triangle. Okay, down here, Massachusetts Superior Court. I conduct research and I find a case in my research from the Massachusetts Court of Appeals that is a similar issue, so it's precedent, and it's now, we call this mandatory precedent because it's a higher court in my jurisdiction. If through my research I also find Supreme Judicial Court opinions that are on the same issue, my employment discrimination matter, that is also mandatory binding precedent. Another way of saying this is that all decisions from the Supreme Judicial Court up here become mandatory binding authority on all these lower courts, down to the Massachusetts Appeals Court, down to all the Superior Court and District Courts. We just said that the SJC is the final word on Massachusetts law, and so it is binding mandatory authority on Massachusetts matters. But let's just quickly compare this to this PowerPoint, this slide here, where we talked about the New Jersey triangles and their hierarchy of courts. What if my client is still down here in the Superior Court in Massachusetts in Middlesex County, and through my research, I happen to stumble upon an opinion from the New Jersey Supreme Court, and it happens to deal also with an employment discrimination matter, also gender discrimination in the workplace. And I think, let's say the case is actually really similar to my client, and I want to run to the attorney and say, look what I found. I found really, really good precedent from the Supreme Court of New Jersey. Let's use that. What's your first reaction? Is your first reaction that that's from the highest court of New Jersey, so therefore we bow down to it because it's from the high court? Or is your first reaction, wait a second, that's a different jurisdictional lineage. That's a different triangle. So I don't know what to do with that. So here's why we also talk about something called persuasive authority. Any authorities that we find, so other court cases from other jurisdictions, even if they're from the highest court in that jurisdiction, can still be helpful to our case, right? We don't want to say, oh, just blinders on, don't look at anything another state has done. That's not true. We can, but we call those authorities persuasive. We don't have to follow. The Superior Court judge here in Massachusetts doesn't have to follow what the Supreme Court of New Jersey said. Yes, it's a higher court, but it's not binding authority. It, meaning the Supreme Court of New Jersey, is not binding authority on a lower court in Massachusetts. In fact, the Supreme Court of New Jersey isn't binding authority on any court in Massachusetts, but it can be persuasive. Similarly, if you have a case, let's say you're working on an appeal for a client, and you're up here at the Supreme Judicial Court, and through your research, you find a decision from the Massachusetts Appeals Court. So we're in the same lineage here, right? Your client is up here at the Supreme Judicial Court, but you find a case from the Massachusetts Appeals Court. Is that mandatory or persuasive? Well, in that case, it would still be persuasive because the SJC is the highest court. The SJC doesn't have to follow what the Massachusetts Appeals Court says. It's a lower court. So you see why it's important to know where we are in our client's matter so that as we do our research, we can rank the relevance and importance of the other authorities we find. Another way of saying this is that it's really important when we do research for our client to find cases in our jurisdiction from higher courts in our jurisdiction, because that is our mandatory binding authority that we have to follow. Everything else is persuasive. I'm going to say a couple other important things. All secondary sources. Remember our friend secondary sources from the first PowerPoint here, or the first recording? All secondary sources are persuasive. We can always use secondary sources to try to persuade a court, but nobody has to follow secondary sources. One area that is a little bit more complicated is understanding mandatory and persuasive when we involve the federal. I'm not going to repeat here on this PowerPoint or this video when a federal court applies state law and a state court applies federal law. That's actually a very complicated issue. Your book describes it pretty well, and I'm more than happy to go over it in class, but I don't want to use this recording time to discuss it because it's a pretty complicated issue. But I do want to point out how mandatory and persuasive work here. Remember how we said all these U.S. district courts are at the lowest level? None of these district courts are binding on each other. So what the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts decides is not binding on the U.S. District Court for the District of Maine, New York, Vermont, Southern District of California, and so on, because these are all at the same level. They might be highly persuasive. We often see district courts look to one another, say, hey, what did my sister court over here decide? Because I want to see what they said. But none of it is binding, because these are all lower courts. Remember what we said about how we go up on appeal? From here, the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts goes up onto appeal for the Circuit Court of Appeals. This is a circuit court. This is a higher court. Decisions of the First Circuit Court of Appeal are binding on whom? Only the courts in the First Circuit. So these lower courts down here. The same thing with the Second Circuit. The Second Circuit is a higher court, Second Circuit Court of Appeals. When they make a decision, it is binding on all the districts in the Second Circuit, and so on and so forth. So what this means is First Circuit Court of Appeals, if your client is over here in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey, and you're working on a case there, and through your research you find a precedent that seems really important, but it's from the First Circuit Court of Appeals, that's a high court. Is it binding on your client's matter over here in the U.S. District Court for the District of New Jersey? No, it's only persuasive. Same thing. If you're working on a case here in the U.S. District Court for the District of Massachusetts, and you find a case from the 9th Circuit, 7th Circuit, any other circuit other than the First Circuit, it's still only persuasive. Just as we said that all of these courts are at the same level, these courts of appeals are also at the same level. So Second Circuit decisions, only binding on the cases in the Second Circuit. Second Circuit decisions, not binding on the First Circuit, but persuasive. Not binding on the Third Circuit, but persuasive. These are actually pretty persuasive courts. They're held in very high esteem and high regard. So these courts do look to each other to try to decide how to resolve issues, but they're not bound by each other. All of them are bound by the U.S. Supreme Court. Everybody in here is bound by the U.S. Supreme Court. Okay, I know I went through this rather quickly. I hope you have the opportunity to listen to all of these videos, and you can certainly repeat them and rewind them if you want to hear a concept again. Please come to class next week prepared with your questions. I just want to jump over for a second to see where the, oh, I have too many things open. Oh, good. Look, I went over. So here's our Blackboard page. So on Blackboard, I did post, not only do we have all 4 videos here now, but you also have an updated homework situation, which is basically just to watch these videos. And then I would love for you to also read through this worksheet here. It just has a handful of problems on it having to do with mandatory and persuasive. I'm not going to collect it. It's not for a grade, but it's something I would like us to go over together in class. So be prepared to discuss it either with me in front of class. I might do breakout rooms and have you guys get to know each other and maybe work with a few others on some of these questions. And then we'll come back together, because what I'm not going to do is use class time on Tuesday to repeat everything that's in these 4 videos. That's enough of me talking. So I hope this has been really helpful. I will not be on my computer on Thursday, but if you have any questions Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, I will be around and able to answer your questions electronically. Again, there's nothing to turn in for homework, but just come to class prepared on Tuesday. Last but certainly not least, I also made Unit 3 available, or Week 3 available for you also, just so you can look ahead to see what's coming next week. All right, I'll see you guys next week, everybody.